Hello,
Hoş geldiniz.
I'm Dr. Işılay Gürsu,
I'm Dr. Peter Cherry.
and welcome to the Heritage Turkey podcast by the British Institute at Ankara, BIAA. Today, we are very happy to have Benjamin Irvine with us. And Benjamin has received his PhD degree from the Freie Universität in Berlin in 2017 and is currently an honorary research fellow of the BIAA. He was previously one of the postdoctoral fellows between 2018 and 2020, and he is a bioarchaeologist, and we are going to ask about this to him, and specializes on Anatolia.
And some extra special news that we get to do, so this is a Heritage Turkey exclusive, is that Ben has recently been appointed as assistant professor in the Department of Archaeology at Kent University. So hello and congratulations.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
I guess the first question then is, what is a bioarchaeologist?
So a bioarchaeologist is, depending on whether you're using the American terminology or the British and European terminology. So in America, it refers to people who study just human remains within that archaeological context. But in Britain and Europe, we tend to use it for all like previously living things from archaeological context. So like animals, plants, and humans. And one of the reasons I consider myself a bioarchaeologist is because not only do I study human remains and skeletons, but I also do a lot of stable isotope work on all three, so humans, plants, and animals. So I tend to work with all of them, not just the human remains as well.
Then maybe we can ask you what's an isotope analysis?
Isotope analysis. So obviously there's elements in the world, and then within the elements there's different isotopes, and some of them are stable and some of them are not. And ratios of these isotopes are found in your body. Mm-hmm. So in your hair, your nails, your blood, your plasma, your bones. And it's held usually within the collagen, so that's the living part, like the protein part of your bones. And by examining the ratios of certain elements, these stable isotopes, we can tell things like what people were eating, where they were moving around, or their origins, where they came from, and then before when they died. And looking into things like agricultural management in plants, so irrigation, manuring, things like this. And then in animals, things like animal management, so feeding strategies, pastoralism, birth spacing, birth seasonality, and things like this. So there's a lot of stuff we can find by looking at sort of the micro level within bones and plants.
So isotope analysis is one of the methodologies that you are using.
One of the methodologies. So there's, like I say, so that's like a microscopic way, sort of biomolecular, and we can go from the very top. So it's like macroscopic, so that's looking at just, we're talking about the human bones mostly today, I think. So macroscopic, we're just looking at the bones. So you have the bones in your hand and you analyze them, you measure them, this kind of stuff. And then obviously if you do sampling, so another example of molecular or biomolecular would be something like aDNA, so ancient DNA analysis as well. So looking at the very tiny things within bones to tell us more about people.
Great. Do you excavate these bones or do you work on them in the laboratory? How does the whole process work?
It works in both ways. More recently in my career, I've been mostly in the labs, so doing like things like stable isotopes, working with bones, and often a lot of what you have is called like legacy collections. So say excavations happened 20 years ago, 50 years ago, whatever, and they have these human remains that maybe haven't been analyzed at all or haven't been analyzed as fully and completely. So they'll be stored in a depot or a lab somewhere at an institute or a university or something. So then you analyze the bones in the lab. But obviously you have to get the bones from the excavations. And it's actually a very important thing is that within the field, we're now trying to make sure that at every excavation, there's someone, preferably a specialist, a professional, who's trained in excavation techniques so that we don't lose information, we don't risk breaking bones or losing material, that kind of stuff. So it's useful and, like I'd say, very important to have a specialist at site doing the actual excavation as well, or at least overseeing it.
So you mentioned we're mostly talking about human bones, but then that leads to the question, is there a big difference with dealing with animal bones and human bones?
Well, the thing I always like about human bones is there's only one species. At least you're talking about modern humans. So zoo archaeologists, the people who work with animal bones, they have to learn all the bones of all species, so mammals, reptiles, birds, fish, all this kind of stuff, and all the different species within those categories. So sheep, goat, cow, pigs, whatever kind of thing. So, that's one easy answer is to give is it's much simpler. You have to memorize just one set of bones and one set of anatomy. But then there's differences, generally we have the similar skeletons. So we have obviously like forelimbs or arms and lower limbs, legs and things like this. But the way they're kind of constructed, the way they're matched together, for example, is different to animals and humans. And animal bones tend to be thicker. So one of the things we look at if we have just a fragment of a bone and we're not sure whether it's human or animal, is we tend to look at the thickness of if you imagine if you cut a bone in half, you'd have like a ring, and then inside there'd be sort of this spongy bone, we call it. And the differences between the humans and animals is distinct enough that we can usually identify.
I think this is also a good point just to plug the fact that the BIA has a bone reference collection, which I'm sure has been very useful to you.
Of animals, yeah. The BIA reference collections are great, and I'd highly recommend anyone who's interested in animals, plants, or pottery as well, to go and use those resources at the British Institute. I haven't used them so much, obviously, because I'm mostly focused on human remains, and also so it's like a reference collection, so it's not really there to be sampled. So it wouldn't be like I'd be doing isotope work, for example, on the plants or the animals at the British Institute. It's more for people who want to compare with material they have from an excavation, see, to identify species of plants or animals and stuff like this, see how things compare.
So let's stick with the human bones now. Yes. And I'm assuming that most of these skeletons are coming from graves, and those are the ones that had a proper burial.
Yeah.
But how often do you come across tragedies like earthquakes, fires, or things like that?
Yeah, so you mentioned there's graves, obviously, is most of the sort of places that we'd find interments or burials and human remains and skeletons. And these can be so at a certain period in Anatolian prehistory, in early Anatolian prehistory, they tend to be burying individuals within houses or around houses, but within the settlement. So we call that intramural burials. So it's within the sort of the confines of the settlement. So think of Çatalhöyük, for example, as a famous example, where they have these multiple burials within houses, but beneath the floors. In a later period, so sort of around about the third millennium, they start to, and maybe fourth millennium as well, they start to use extramural cemeteries. So think of now today, if you go to a town, there'll usually be a designated cemetery outside of the limits of the city walls or the limits of the town or village or whatever it is. So sometimes we find the cemeteries and then we excavate the cemeteries, and other times it's during excavation of buildings or architecture that we find these burials. But then of course, obviously, as mentioned, if there's things like natural disasters, so there's a famous example from it's Cheshire, I think, and they think they found a victim of a tsunami there. For example, there was a person in a room that wasn't buried in a uniform and sort of formal manner, and was probably a victim of something like this. But obviously, we have victims of earthquakes, fires, intentional human destruction. So another classic example is at Kirkenes, for example. There was 2 individuals there found beneath the rubble of the Cappadocia Gate, and that was probably people who were fleeing the attack on the city and were caught up in a fire or destruction.
So we were talking beforehand about bodies that have been murdered.
Yeah.
Can you actually tell if someone's been murdered from their skeleton?
Well, as sort of people who deal with human remains like me, so I'd call myself in that term, within bioarchaeology, I'd be a human osteoarchaeologist. And we tend to be cautious. We tend to err on caution. So we have 3, if we're talking about injuries, for example, like a murder injury, like a hole in the head or broken bones or whatever. So we have antemortem, so that's before death, and it's usually there's a sign of healing. So that implies to us that the person survived whatever injury or attack they had. And then we have post-mortem, which are breaks that happened after death. So sometimes it can be from the weight of the soil or the burial environment. Maybe if they're using like a stone lid on the coffin or something and that falls in, that might crush the bones. And there's different patterns and different colorations of the bones we can tell between antemortem and postmortem. And then in the middle, we have perimortem injuries. And perimortem happens around the time of death. And what that means is there's no time for the body to start healing. So they leave a very distinct pattern. And when we have perimortem injuries, especially injuries of the skulls on the cranium, so like say you're getting like a slice through the skull or a hole in the head or something like this, and if it's a perimortem injury, we can say that it probably contributed towards the death, but it's rare that we might be able to say that someone definitely died from that particular injury, but it might be likely or probable that they did. So sometimes, yeah, we can kind of get an indication of people may have been murdered or massacred or human sacrifice, these kind of things. But it's not always as clear. And like I say, we tend to be quite cautious people. So we don't usually tend to say, oh, this person was murdered. We tend to say these people had these injuries and it's unlikely that they survived them, or that there may have been something like an infection, for example, that we can't see on the bone necessarily because it's a short-term infection that may have resulted in the death.
So most of your research is on prehistoric sites, so that is before writing. And writing usually gives a direct voice to the people. Yeah. So as far as I can think, like your kind of working with the bones is giving a direct access to the individuals of that period. So my question is, how does it feel to excavate a skeleton considering this access?
I mean, that's one of the things I love about what I do, is because it is giving that voice to people. And even in like sort of historical times, writing times, sometimes it's not always records of certain places or certain burials, or again, if we're talking about natural disaster like before, there might not always be a record of those individuals because they're caught up in a disaster or something. So, and there's so much, I think one of the things that a lot of people don't understand, even archaeologists, is how much you can get from human remains, from skeletons, even at the macroscopic level. So, you know, we're looking at basic things like biological sex of an individual, so male, female, age at death, but then also things like diseases, injuries, dietary stuff, habitual activities. So if someone's doing something regularly, like for example, they really good example is the Mary Rose shipwreck. They found bones of the sailors they went down with the ship, and they have distinct markers on their skeleton in their shoulder blade area and sort of the shoulder girdle area. And they figured out that was probably from doing archery. So because someone was doing archery over their entire life, it leaves distinct marks on the bone. That's another thing people don't remember, or people forget about bones, is that bone basically, when it's living at least, it's not a sort of a plastic uniform material. It responds to stresses, external stresses. So the classic example we were always taught when I was sort of doing my early courses in this field was there's an X-ray from a tennis player who was right-handed, and their right forearm, the bones are much bigger than their left forearm because they're using a lot more. So we can do these kind of things, but there's a lot we can ask but also answer looking at human remains. For me it feels great. It's not everyone's cup of tea. I admit that. Some people are a little bit squeamish about it, and not so. They don't think it's the best or most fun thing to be doing. But I look at it from a very scientific perspective, and I think just the wealth of information that we can get, especially in these sort of, like you said, these prehistoric periods, pre-writing periods, it's really important. And I mean, at the end of the day, archaeology is the study of humans in the past and their life ways. And if you're not studying the humans, then you're missing out the closest and key point in terms of research.
So many archaeologists working in Anatolia work or specialize in a particular area. So, a particular period. So, the Iron Age or Byzantine, for example. But as I gather, you're working on skeletons from across all of those periods. So do you see any changes, for example, a Byzantine skeleton versus a Neolithic, for example?
So, I mean, this sort of brings you back to one of the answers I gave earlier about the animals and humans. I mean, humans is one species, and they, at least since we've kind of evolved into being modern humans, we tend not to have changed too much. So it doesn't matter whether a skeleton necessarily from the Neolithic or from the Byzantine period, they tend to be pretty similar. And that's, I guess, one of the things I also like, is that I have flexibility in time periods I work in, regions I can work in. Like, I've always kind of sort of half joked that, a skeleton's a skeleton. The main thing that changes is burial types. So I was mentioning before about intramural burial versus extramural burial. And obviously when you get things later on like Christian burials or Islamic burials, there's distinctive ways that people are buried. So those kind of things change more than the skeletons themselves. But we do see some differences over time. For example, do you know what dental caries are, for example?
No.
So the holes in your teeth when you go to the dentist and if you eat too many sweets and stuff. So
we know.
yeah,
We have.
So dental caries are caused by basically a predominant consumption of carbohydrates. And basically, hunter-gatherers, we don't see many dental caries because obviously this is pre-agriculture, so it's pre-cereals, pre-wheat, pre-barley, things like this. And then after sort of the Neolithic, and then especially in the early Bronze Age in Anatolia, sort of this late 4th, 3rd millennium period, we see a massive increase in the incidence and frequency of caries because the diet becomes more revolved around eating carbohydrates, so cereals, bread, things like this and stuff. So we can see certain changes like that. And then obviously another example is violence is we see changes. So for example, in Neolithic periods and sort of early middle Chalcolithic periods, we tend not to see so many big weapon-related injuries. But in the Bronze Age, obviously when they start having metal weapons, metal spears, swords, axes and stuff, we start to see these big kind of cuts in the head and big holes in the head and stuff caused by metal weapons. So there's things like this. And obviously later on you have things like firearms or cannonballs and stuff, which cause distinct injuries on the body and things. So there are, I wouldn't say you'd use them to identify a time period, but yeah, sometimes across periods or between periods when you compare them, you can see them. And then another example is, again, is things like dental health, oral health. Once you get like processed sugars coming in, sort of the later medieval, sort of in 16th century, 17th century, these kind of periods, you obviously start to see a degradation in dental health and things like this.
Which sites have you excavated in Turkey? And also, like, how did you end up or decide working in Anatolia?
So the first time I was actually ever in Turkey was in 2008, and I worked on the late Chalcolithic site of Çamlıbel Tarlası, which is near Hattusha. So it's in Çorum. So I worked there for a few years, and then I ended up sort of basically doing a lot of lab stuff because I got more involved with the isotope side of things. So I wasn't doing as much field work. But recently, I'm now involved with the new excavation at Turkmenkarahisar in Konya, where I'm the head of the human osteoarchaeology lab there. So any human remains that are going to come out of that site, I'll be excavating them and analysing them and stuff. And I've done a few bits and pieces of analysing here and there, but like I say it's mostly either, like, remember before I was talking about like legacy stuff, so working on previously excavated material, so it's not really working on the site or excavating it. So it's kind of weird. I've worked on a lot of sites and a lot of projects in Turkey and Anatolia, but not necessarily primarily excavation. And the reason why I came here, I was always, ever since I knew I wanted to do archaeology when I was sort of in my late teens. I knew I wanted to go to university and do archaeology, and I was always more interested in this part of the world than, say, Northern European or British archaeology. I always thought I wanted to work somewhere between Greece and Iran and somewhere between the South Caucasus and Egypt. That was my kind of window of where I wanted to work. And actually, working in Turkey was a coincidence. So the director, Ulf Schoup, of Çamlıbel Tarlası project, he was one of my lecturers, professors at Edinburgh University where I did my undergraduate. And he just sent an email around the undergraduate, said, I've got this new project. Does anybody want to come? And I think I was the only one who replied. So it was by default, really. And then I kind of, once I came here, I kind of caught the bug, and I haven't left, really.
Great. What can you say about archaeology's like position? Because there's a sort of an argument about whether it should be seen as a social science, which it is for the standard, for the case of the BIA, or for some as a hard science. Where do you sit with this? Because you're using quite a lot of, hard scientific terminology.
To me, it's nothing but everything. It's not a social science or a hard science. It's a mixture of all of them. And it's one of the reasons I loved archaeology from the sort of, like I say, from my late teens and wanted to do it, was there's so many opportunities. You can do the social science stuff, the cultural side, and then you can do the hard science stuff. You can do the chemistry and all this kind of stuff. There's a lot of opportunities, a lot of different things you can do, a lot of exciting things you do. Especially things like bioarchaeology, because obviously, like I mentioned before, we're using these kind of scientific techniques. It tends to be at the forefront of using scientific techniques. So that side, I'd say, is more towards science, and obviously it's based on biology at the end of the day. So you're looking at anatomy of things and pathologies, diseases, illnesses, and that kind of stuff. But yeah, the simple answer is none of them, but all of them.
You often tell collective stories in your research, like human-environment interaction and mobility. Is there room to hear like individual stories, such as outliers that do not fit into certain categories, and do they get enough recognition?
Yeah, of course. Just recently I had a paper published that we looked at just one individual, one skeleton, because it had an interesting pathology. So that's like one person's story. And again, like I was mentioning before, about like going from the macroscopic to the microscopic to the biomolecular, molecular levels, you can do the same thing with the research. So you can go from the sort of very small scale, one individual has something interesting. So again, a classic example from Europe would be things like they're sort of called like irregular or abnormal burials. So if you think of like vampire burials, so they're often buried with like teeth between the bricks between their teeth, or they were chained down or staked down to stop them rising out of the grave. So there's things like this that sort of at a very individual or small scale level. It's very interesting. Then obviously you can then apply it to much larger, broader pictures. And I think generally archaeology across the world, more recently, the research trends have tended to want to look towards bigger pictures. So that's maybe why we're seeing more of these kind of involving lots of different aspects and bring them all together. But at the same time, archaeology, like I mentioned before, is like that. It's a sort of it's a discipline that covers lots of different things, and it works best when it's holistic. So the more things you can involve and look at, the more lines of evidence you can use, basically, the better idea you have of how things may have been in the past.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask a bit more about the vampires?
Yeah, of course.
So, I mean, how common is that? And do you find as well, like elements of, I guess, like superstitions, obviously people being buried in particular ways due to those kind of beliefs in vampires and witches, etc.?
That's basically it. It was superstition. So you don't see them across everywhere, and different places have different traditions of these things. But there is definitely, there's in certain places at certain time periods when I guess superstition of vampires or people rising from the dead to feed on the living or haunt people or whatever was at its highest. You do see these kind of things where people are chained into the ground, or they're locked in like sort of lead-lined sealed coffins, or the classic one is brick or something between the teeth to stop them biting people. And there's other examples of similar things to that, but that's I guess one of the more famous ones of these kind of things.
Interesting.
Must have been a horrible experience.
Yeah.
You think of also there's other ways. So if you look at Victorian periods, especially in Britain, a lot of people were being buried with cages around their graves to stop body snatchers for medical research.
Right, of course.
Yeah. So that's
Burke and Hare, obviously.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So things like this, people start to have things like that. They'd have like a cage or some sort of protection over their grave to stop body snatchers and stuff.
Because you must find as well, I mean, this feeds into the episode we did with Emma Baisal, soon to be your colleague.
Yeah.
You must find objects as well that are with the skeletons on occasions as well.
So objects with the skeletons, from an archaeological side, they're very useful for dating. So obviously metal objects will only be from sort of the mid 4th millennium onwards in Anatolia, because that's when we get metals first, really, or at least on a larger production scale. So they're useful for that. They can be used for maybe identifying status in some way, identity. If people are identifying in a certain way, they might be buried with certain things, exotic items, for example, things like this and stuff. So so part of human osteoarchaeology is what we call mortuary archaeology. So it's looking at the burial environment. So looking at not just the individual within it, but how they're buried. So what kind of grave they're in, how it's cut, whether they have a coffin or not, whether the grave's lined with stones, or whether it has a marker, like a gravestone type thing, whether it's in a cemetery, in a formal cemetery, whether it's below a house, whether it's in a special building, whether there's objects or items. A really good example from Anatolia is the very early sort of Neolithic, sort of early Holocene burials from Kirtik Tepe. And they painted the bones there, and they wrapped them in mats and stuff and plaster and things like this. So, and at Çatalhöyük, they also found some probably evidence of individuals being buried in things like mats or baskets and things like this. So there's a lot you can find out about that. Gives you more an indication of how the living viewed the dead and how they treated the dead. So different burial practices, or like I say, within mortuary archaeology, are useful for that kind of thing. So, I mean, an archaeologist will tell you it's only useful for dating. That's all they're interested in. So, but there's a lot more you can tell, as I'm sure Emma explained probably better than I could now.
Shall we ask about forensic archaeology to to refer to how archaeology can be used in recent cases?
Yeah. So, so forensic anthropology is kind of almost a field in its own, but there's definitely overlaps. So you have the skills that you acquire as a sort of human osteoarchaeologist or someone who deals with excavating human remains or analyzing human remains has an overlap in forensics. Because obviously you have to identify the burial environment, how someone was buried, whether they're in a formal burial or whether they were dumped somewhere in a ditch, down a well, these kind of things, buried in a sack in the corner of a room, whatever it is. But then also you need to obviously know things like anatomy. So you need to know what the bones are, how they fit together, and be able to identify certain things on the bones. So like diseases, illnesses, injuries, like I mentioned before. I'd say forensics is more designed with sort of more modern cases and is specifically related to crime or potential crimes. But like I say, the archaeologists and the human osteoarchaeologists and the skills we have, we could definitely there's definitely overlap into going into that world. And actually in America, it's quite common that if you're a professor at university or something where you're dealing with, you're a specialist in human remains, you may liaise with local police forces for forensic cases.
Can I ask something that is that I find quite interesting and maybe a little bit frustrating? Sometimes some other scientists make very liberal comments about how archaeology labels things. In a recent podcast, for instance, I'm not going to name it, but a neuroscientist was talking about women giving birth at a certain hour of the day in the Paleolithic times in the caves. Yeah. And judging from what you have been telling us, in order to make this comment, you need a lot of research, and it's almost impossible to say such a thing with such certainty. So I was wondering, why do you think that the other scientists may feel themselves so free to make these kinds of comments?
Well, I think at the moment, the misuse of archaeology and the misinterpretation of archaeology is a hot topic. I mean, just very recently, I don't know if you saw the news about they found the tunnels beneath the pyramids in Egypt. Yeah. And people are already saying it's some sort of underground city or maybe some ancient power network or, these kind of things and stuff. And I guess it's because people are excited. So maybe we should kind of see it as a compliment. So people want to imagine something fantastic and something spectacular. And then sometimes it's just a misunderstanding of something. They may have read a report or a paper, like an article or something, and they've misunderstood what's said in it, or they may have combined maybe some archaeological evidence with ethnographic evidence or something, and then they've put the two together, and it doesn't always match up. I mean, at least from my side, so the example you gave, I think unless someone wrote on a cave, I gave birth at 4 a.m. on a Sunday at a full moon or whatever, I'd say it's almost impossible to tell that from the bones alone. There's no way we can tell that. Because again, especially when looking at macroscopic stuff with bones, you're basically looking at the life of a person, obviously. So if someone breaks their arm and it heals, you may still see evidence of that heel fracture. So it's something within that person's story. We call it a human osteobiography. So it's the biography of that person. So there's that story, but it's of their whole life. It's not of a particular one moment. Again, maybe perimortem injuries, I mentioned before, right sort of at the end of their life, that may be one small snapshot of their life. But most things we're looking at an accumulation. That's one of the things with bones, so especially diseases and illnesses, those kind of pathologies on bones, they're very difficult to identify because they're only visible on the bones if they're basically chronic or they've been for a long time. There tends to be few, apart from obviously weapon injuries type things or breaks, fractures, there tends to be very few other things that give such an immediate evidence immediately visible on the bones. So yeah, and I mean we can say with some certainty probably people that have given birth or maybe at least had a lot of children. There are certain evidence on female pelvises that may suggest some scarring, that may suggest childbirth or maybe difficult childbirth. But in terms of one particular moment, it's difficult to say. And obviously, even in historical periods, they may have said in Roman times or Byzantine times, there may be medical books that say, it's best that women give birth this way or at this time or something. But we can't say for certain from the archaeological or the human osteoarchaeology, from the bones themselves.
Thank you.
So this, I know, is a little bit of a controversial topic.
Yeah.
So skeletons in museums and being exhibited anyway. How do you feel about them? Is it ethical? I don't know. Is it?
It is a controversial question, and there's definitely differing and varying viewpoints on it. And one of my opinions has always kind of been, as long as it's demonstrating or showing something interesting or for science, or there's a purpose to it, not just a gratuitous display of human remains, then I think that's okay. But because of the controversy and because of modern technology, actually, I don't see necessarily why, if it is such a big issue for people, why we don't necessarily have to display them. So, for example, a good example that I saw last year was at the new Chatelhøyk Museum. They have bones on display, but they're 3D printed bones, so they're not actual human remains. And then they also have an interactive video thing. So it's sort of like it's actually scanned images of bones, but then when you sort of press on the screen, it'll tell you more about the bone or more about injuries or pathologies that they found on those kind of bones, on those particular bones. So yeah, these days we have things like 3D printing, which has become, obviously that technology is improving sort of monthly, if not yearly and stuff. We have 3D scanning now, which is getting a lot better, and things like this. So and sort of interactive video, things like this. So we don't necessarily have to display human remains anymore. But I think, like I was mentioning before, because human remains are such a big part of our past, because they're basically us in the past.
Yeah, of course.
I think it's important not to dismiss them completely. That there is a place, there's a right time and a place for these kind of things, but of course it has to be done in an ethical way, in the right situation, and for the right reasons, in the right context.
There is actually a wonderful paper published in Public Archaeology Journal in 2021 by Şen Ocak, Doğan, and Joy, where they look at this issue in Turkey. So it's called Who Owns the Dead? And they interviewed experts and museum visitors about their ideas about how human remains are displayed in museums. So that brings me to another question, which is, when you talk about what kind of work you do, when you explain what kind of work you do, what kind of reactions do you get from like non-experts or public?
It varies even within the sort of academic community, not just non-experts. Some people are very excited. I mean, if you think of like things like the popularity of Halloween or the Festival of the Dead in Mexico, these kind of things and stuff. So skeletons and death and things around death have always captured human imagination. Again, we go back to the vampire burials. That's that's something that sort of captured people's imagination or superstition in some way. So yeah, some people are fascinated, and especially when you tell them exactly what you can get from human remains individually, but also as a group, like a population. And some people don't want to know about it. So I mean, I won't mention where, but there was one place where I was working, and we had to move skeletons from the depot to the lab to work on them, and we had to pass through a corridor which wasn't archaeology related. And when the people in the offices realized what we were moving through along the corridor, they shut their doors because they didn't like the idea of seeing these things. So some people are like this, and other people, I'd say most non-experts actually are very curious, at least, and sort of what can you find from these things? Why are you doing this research, and why is it important, and it must be amazing to do that. You tend to get more positive responses from, which I think was one of the findings from this paper as well.
I think our audience is going to think the same,
I hope so.
I am so sure. I think
don't end up getting cancelled.
Well, let me ask you then the final question, which is, so you, as a career, you handle bones.
Yeah.
How would you feel about someone handling your bones and excavating your skeleton?
I've always said I want to be cremated, so someone will have to deal with my cremated bones or my dust. But other than that, I mean, I guess it'd be hypocritical of me to say that I wouldn't want it happening. So I just wish I was around to see what they thought.
Well, you never know who's listening, so there might be some young aspiring archaeologist.
I mean, if this podcast lasts another 1,000 years, then we'll see.
Which hopefully it will. So anyway, well, thanks very much.
Well,
Ben.
thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
This was wonderful.
Yeah, teşekkürler. and
Görüşürüz.
Görüşürüz.
Teşekkürler.